Let's get going, and when Carlos joins, we will roll right into this. So my name is Michael Goldberg, for those that are joining us for this session, and I'm the Executive Director of our Veal Institute for Entrepreneurship here at Case Western Reserve University, and this is our third session today, and our first one were the speakers in person, so it's awesome to welcome Joe Nahra back to Cleveland. And to campus here. Christina Hickson, who's a women's soccer player and Weatherhead undergraduate student, and the women's soccer team at Case is kicking butt these days, so go check them out. Undefeated?
Yes.
Undefeated. Game this weekend. So Christina is going to moderate today's panel. Carlos Fleming from Endeavor will hopefully be joining as well, and it's on the topic of name, image, likeness. But Joe and Carlos both have a deep background on many topics, so as today's conversation starts around NIL, but feel free to ask questions in other areas. So with that, I will turn it over to Christina, who's going to run the show.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's discussion on name, image, likeness. I'm here with Joe in person, and Carlos should be joining soon. So Joe is working in legal and business affairs for the Oakview Group, and is also a former staff counsel for the NFL Players Association. Carlos is a partner in sports talent head at Endeavor, and has expertise working and managing the careers of high-profile athletes. So I'd like to encourage all of you to ask questions, but to begin, I'll ask a few, starting with you, Joe. Would you be able to go into your background a little bit and just your experience with the subject?
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Professor Goldberg. It's great to be here. I am a Case alum from the law school and a native, and went to Hawken, and I understand there's a lot of Hawken people in the audience, so it's really a pleasure to be here. I currently work at a company that has really nothing to do with NIL. I work at a company called the Oakview Group, which is involved in building arenas and managing arenas. But I've only been there since January, and for the 25 or so years prior to that, I was involved in NIL every day. I worked out of law school. I worked for IMG, which is now part of Endeavor, a big sports talent agency representing athletes. I then went to the NFL Players Association, where I was also very involved in NIL from the standpoint of licensing the NFL players' names and images in all sorts of consumer products. Probably most notably the EA Madden NFL franchise, but all sorts of consumer products, trading cards, jerseys, bobblehead dolls, you name it. Any product that had a player on it, I was involved in the licensing of that. I spent 10 years at the Players Association, and then another 10 years at CAA, Creative Artists Agency, which is very similar to IMG in that it's mostly a large talent representation firm. And there I represented athletes across a bunch of sports, not just football, doing lots of name, image, and likeness contracts, endorsement deals. And I was there for 10 years. So that eventually led me to the Oakview Group, where I'm no longer in NIL, but I do teach a class at NYU called Intellectual Property and Licensing, where we're discussing NIL a lot, as you can imagine.
Thank you. So I think it'd be helpful for everyone just if you could briefly describe like the legislation, what's kind of going on right now.
Okay. Well, I guess the first thing I want to make sure, since this is an academic environment, I want to make sure that everyone sort of understands when we say NIL, what are we really talking about? And I guess maybe the simplest way to think of it is NIL is kind of like a trademark or a copyright or a patent It's a form of intellectual property. It's actually called the right of publicity. And the right of publicity is a right that we all have. Some of our rights are more valuable than others, depending on how famous you are. But we all have a right of publicity, which means the right to control the use of our name, our image, our likeness in a commercial context. So in an ad to promote a product, those types. Does the Cleveland Plain Dealer need our permission?
I'm going to swap you out, Joe.
If this event if there was media here and somebody took a picture of me and put it in the Plain Dealer, do they need permission to use my image? No, they don't, because they're a media organization and they're under the First Amendment, they don't have to get permission. They're not considered to be a commercial enterprise in that sense. But if Nike showed up and Nike decided they were going to put a picture of us in an advertisement, that would be a commercial use. That would be a violation of our rights of publicity if they didn't get our permission. So what NIL is it's all of a sudden in the college industry, the student athletes are allowed to make money off of licensing their right of publicity. It's obviously something that we've been doing with professional athletes my whole career, but with college athletes, it's brand new. And the history behind it, it's a little bit complex, but it started really with a couple of lawsuits that weren't specifically on this point, but they were related. Like there was an Ed O'Bannon lawsuit. He was a basketball player at UCLA. And he saw that his name and image was being used in the EA Sports college basketball video game. And he didn't think that seemed fair. He wasn't making any money from it, and so he filed a lawsuit. And he ended up winning that lawsuit, but what the court said was that colleges should be allowed to pay student athletes up to the actual cost of attendance, which was a little bit more than a scholarship. The scholarship pays for tuition, room, and board, but there are other costs that aren't included in a scholarship. So the court said, well, you can pay those additional costs. So that didn't really quite get us to where we are today. There was another lawsuit called the Alston versus the Ncaa, and that was also a case involving challenging, under the antitrust laws, the NCAA's ability to put limits on what student athletes could receive. And it's specifically related, it was a very narrow case, it's specifically related to costs associated with education. So the O'Bannon case said you can cover these additional costs of attendance. And what the Alston case said was, well, if you're a student athlete and you're a music major, and you play the violin, the university can buy you a violin. That's related to your education. Or if you are named, Science Student of the Year, you can receive, a new laptop computer if that's what they decide to give you, because it's all related to education. So that took it a step further than the O'Bannon case. But what those cases both did, which was really significant, and it led to the NCAA making a pretty monumental decision earlier this year, was those cases both said that we're going to look at any NCAA restrictions on what students, athletes can receive. We're going to take a real close look at it. We're going to subject it to antitrust scrutiny. And in both of those prior cases, O'Bannon and Alston, the NCAA lost. So the writing was on the wall that challenges to restrictions on name, image, and likeness income were going to get struck down. And so the NCAA basically threw up its hands. Sort of at the same time that all this was happening, states started passing legislation that would take precedent over NCAA rules, or at least that was the idea. So states started basically saying that you can't nobody can restrict a student athlete's ability to earn income from their name, image, and likeness. And all these different states started passing laws that were sort of the same but nuanced with differences. And they are all starting to go into effect. I think the first one as of July 1st, 2021. And I think it was June 30th when the Ncaa announced, okay, fine. If you're a student athlete and you're in a state where there's legislation, then whatever the legislation's rules say, those are the rules you have to stand by. If you are in a state where there aren't any rules, then the Ncaa rules are going to apply, but we're not really going to enforce any rules other than there's a couple things that the Ncaa is trying to enforce where there aren't statutes in the states, and those are they don't want you to use name, image, and likeness income as an inducement to try to recruit student athletes, like, hey, come to our school and we guarantee you're going to make $1 million in NIL revenue. They also don't want to use it as paying for play. So they don't want a student athlete to be paid additional amounts under their NIL deal if they are, say, named, Big Ten Player of the Year, or if they receive some sort of on-field bonus. They don't want the student athlete to receive additional compensation because they view that as pay for play, which is, hey, come to our school, play football for us, and we'll pay you X amount of dollars. And the Ncaa also doesn't want the universities really playing matchmaker with the buyers, with the Nikes or the trading card companies or whoever you might be doing an NIL deal. They don't want the schools setting up those deals, which has led to the emergence of a bunch of companies that are stepping into that space to try to play matchmaker.
Thank you very much. And I also see Carlos joined us. We briefly introduced you, but I was wondering if you could go into your background a little bit and your experience with the subject matter.
First of all, hello everyone, and thank you guys for having me here. Especially Joe and Michael Goldenberg are some old friends from my days in Cleveland where I grew up. So it's awesome to be together with you guys and to be able to do this panel. Joe, I certainly know now why you're such a highly regarded professor, because that was a great analysis of NIL. It's a super complicated topic, and there's been a lot of twists and turns along the way. So, that was really cool to hear you go through that. My background is, as I mentioned, I'm a native of Cleveland, Ohio. I grew up in Shaker Heights, went to university school for high school. I was a tennis player. At that time, IMG, when I grew up in Cleveland, IMG was headquartered in Cleveland, Ohio. I was a scholarship athlete in tennis at Kansas University. And the O'Bannon case came shortly after I graduated. He was a contemporary of mine, and I think he filed his suit probably in the mid to late 90s, so just after I graduated from college. And quite frankly, how I got into sports representation, so I ultimately started my career at IMG, but after leaving Kansas, I saw, kind of at the ground level, I saw a lot of what we're talking about today. Kansas basketball team was massive at that time. They had won the national basketball title the year before I came. The field house, Allen Fieldhouse, was right next to the tennis facility. So every Tuesday I'd see the CBS trucks pull up. I would see, the fans fill into the stadium. You'd see the sponsors inside the stadium. And you just start to realize it's a big business. And that's quite frankly what got me interested in doing sports representation. But it's kind of interesting to see how the collegiate part of it and the professional part of it have kind of come full circle. Professional in terms of my job as an agent representing professional athletes. So I started my career at IMG in 1997. The first players I worked with on the tennis side were Venus and Serena Williams. I spent about 10 years working in tennis. Tennis, we don't commission the on-the-court revenue, so it's really all about off-the-court brand building. You think the Nike deals, you think the Adidas deals, and then kind of building out from there to the Rolexes, and it can be AT&T or all the other commercials that you guys see on television. So I did that for about 10 years and just realized that there are other professional athletes who you could apply the same kind of process to, kind of athletes that transcend their sport, that transcend the playing field, who, they could also use that kind of strategy behind their marketing and business development. So that kind of led to a division, which we called it IMG, Sports Talent Marketing. So I worked in that department. I kind of worked in tennis and sports talent marketing, continued to represent high-profile tennis players, but then started to work with professional athletes outside of tennis, including Cam Newton, Colin Kaepernick, Victor Cruz, Christian Pulisic now in soccer, Michelle Wie in golf. So kind of a variety of other athletes. We were acquired, IMG was acquired by William Morris Endeavor in 2014. And when we were acquired by William Morris Endeavor, by then I had left Cleveland. I'd gone from initially to Miami. I was in New York at the time. So I spent the next 10 years, not 10 years, 7 or so years in New York working for William Morris Endeavor. So that's where I've been, since 2014. In the last 2 years, we've really transitioned from just kind of being free agents for talent marketing outside of off the court, off the field, to starting to focus on becoming on court and off the court representatives. So we hired 2 coaches agents 2 years ago, which was kind of our first step in that area. We brought in 2 football agents at the end of 2019. And at the end of 2020, we did a joint venture with Bill Duffy's agency, BDA, Sports Management. So my career took a pivot with that last acquisition. So now I'm head of talent marketing for our basketball division. So a lot of what we're talking about today on the NIL side is what I'm doing on a daily basis.
Thank you, Carlos. Could you go a little bit into what kinds of deals are currently being made? Are they all monetary? Just a little bit on that.
What was the question?
Could you go into what kind of deals are being made?
NIL, if I give you kind of the agents kind of side of it is, if I would just put it plainly, it's the wild, wild west right now. I think a lot of Joe's analysis, which it really was helpful to hear that, because I think he really simplified it. And the issues really are, when you look at the NCAA's position on state by state, allowing the individual states, universities to kind of make their own rules for now with no federal regulation. That makes it very challenging for brands. Like if you're Capital One, who's a March Madness sponsor, and you decide you want to do a national TV campaign to support March Madness, that's a legal nightmare, because you're going to have to go market by market, school by school, understand all those different policies. And on top of that, the one thing that we also have to go through is you have to be registered as an agent in each state. And as an agent, if you don't go through that process, then you're risking the kids' eligibility in college. Some of these deals can be nullified. So there's a lot of other risks associated. So it's illegal for companies that are historically buttoned up and, really conservative about risk. It's challenging to navigate NIL without potentially putting yourself at risk. So I think first and foremost, we've seen a lot of the big brands kind of be very kind of reluctant, kind of taking their time. The biggest deals you're going to see right now are trading card deals. I think now being able to access these collegiate athletes, especially if you're one of the top guys, there's pretty significant money on the trading card side. I think local market, you'll see some opportunities. I think there's some, if you think of, UCLA, we represent Johnny Juzang. Being in LA and having so many kind of major businesses, important alumni, it's created a great opportunity for him in terms of NIL marketing. If you're in some of the smaller markets, it's tougher. It can be a little bit more challenging. I think a lot of these deals are being driven by social media. And what's really interesting is it's not necessarily just about the sport you play. So we're seeing, I think probably it's 50-50 in terms of females versus males who are making real money at NIL. So Livy Dunn is probably the highest paid right now. She's a gymnast at LSU. Because of her social media following, she's making a lot of money. She'll be well into the 7 figures in terms of marketing money. So it varies according to the school, the market, the athlete. The big brands right now, I think they're taking more of their time. Like if you think the Nikes and Adidas's and so forth, they're definitely taking their time because they've invested a boatload of money sponsoring these universities. So they're trying to really wrap their head around how to approach NIL. But then when you get down to, certain markets that are interesting with top tier players, I think, some brands and or athletes, some brands and or, local market companies are really be much more proactive.
Thank you. It looks like we have a question from the audience.
Hey guys, my name's Eddie. I'm an alum here at Case Western Reserve. So a question regarding collegiate versus professional NIL. At the professional level, you do have athletes unions, the Players Association with the NFL and the NBA and MLB, whereas at college there's no union representation. How does that affect NIL laws and how the athletes get paid at the professional versus collegiate level?
Thanks. That's a really good question. Yeah, so I mentioned that I worked for the Players Association, and one of the things that I was really actively involved in is what was called their group licensing program. And that's what you've just touched on. It's group licensing. And in professional sports, essentially what happens is that all of the players in Major League Baseball or all of the players in the NBA, they give permission to their players associations to use their NIL and to license their NIL to companies like trading card companies, video game companies, to make products that involve lots of players, groups of players. That's why it's called group licensing. Those athletes, they keep for themselves the right to control how they're used individually. And so those rights as individuals are negotiated by people like Carlos, people in the agent business. And so it is definitely the Wild West when it comes to group licensing in the college space, because if you think about it, there are a whole variety of levels for what would constitute the group. So for example, is the group every football player at Ohio State? Is the group every student athlete at Ohio State? Is the group every football player in the Big Ten? Is the group every student athlete in the Big Ten? So trying to figure that out, it's going to take a long time for that to play out. I think that there are going to be student athletes who are members of multiple groups. There are a number of companies that are out there who are trying to organize that. There's a company called One Team, which was actually started by some people from the NFL Players Association. There's a company called Brander that's now representing Ohio State and UNC and Texas to try to launch group licensing programs. And I think they've announced a couple. Typically, I think they, so far at least, have involved either like one sport, like football, or all the student athletes at that one school. But it's going to be interesting to see, because the student athletes, they really have the choice. Like they can participate in a group licensing program or choose not to. And in professional sports, there's a whole different element to it, because in professional sports, the unions generate their operating revenue from their group licensing programs, and they also generate what they refer to as a war chest, which is a pile of money that they might need for labor relations with their league. So if the NFL Players Association and the NFL, their collective bargaining agreement expires and they're in a lockout or a strike or whatever it might be, they use the money from their group licensing programs to support that litigation, to pay their lawyers. And so the players in those sports, the NBA players, the NFL players, they're incentivized to join the group licensing program because they know it's for the good of their union and if they don't frankly join that program, then in the locker room they're going to hear about it. Their teammates are going to be like, "What are you doing, man? You got to support the union." And that element doesn't really exist in college, so it's going to be really interesting to see what sorts of groups are formed.
I will say from a professional sports perspective and collegiate, as an NFL or NBA athlete, I mean, the background Joe gave is enormously helpful to hear. But these guys also, if you're a star quarterback in the NFL, you're getting 7 figures potentially in mailbox money off your jersey sales and other licensed products. So while, yes, it's also a good deed for your colleagues in the union and helping to make sure you build that war chest, it's kind of one of those revenue sources for some of these top athletes that's, they don't really have to do anything for it other than wear the jersey and be a star player, which is obviously important. But it's not like they have to manufacture the jerseys, get distribution, go out and sell them. The league and the Players Association does that for them. So on the professional side, I think there are some merits that a lot of these athletes see to being part of the group likeness. There are some athletes who have opted out and have decided, for whatever reason, they don't want to feel like they're the ones carrying the load for the masses. But those that have opted out are few and far between. But there is some real financial upside for athletes on the professional side that are part of the group likeness. In college, I think what Joe described is enormously interesting. Because for those sports and those schools that don't have group likeness, we're dealing with this at UCLA right now. You really have the opportunity for an athlete to create their own licensing collection of jerseys, T-shirts, hats, whatever they want, and it's normally pretty streamlined collections. But imagine if LeBron James sold all his jerseys on his own and he kept the royalty off of every one of those jerseys. I mean, I'm not suggesting that these collegiate athletes today are going to have LeBron James quality sales, but it's really an interesting opportunity to take advantage of for some of these athletes while those schools try to figure it out. And to Joe's point, at some point, I'm sure there will be some form of group licensing programs throughout the country, whether it's different sports, conferences, you name it, but they'll figure it out. But for now, it's just created some real opportunities, especially for the star players that play for those schools that haven't really kind of sorted out their plan around group license.
We have a question on Zoom.
Great. Kyle, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes, thanks for being here, guys. Because this is such a new area, and as you guys said, it's kind of like the Wild West, and things are still being figured out. Do you see this kind of momentum continuing, or where do you potentially see this whole part of the industry going in the next 5 to 10 years? Will it remain big, or will there be potential cracks that lead this to not being as big as it seems right now?
Well, I think that it's going to continue to grow. I think it's going to take kind of a long time to work out the kinks. I think what's going to be interesting to see is what Carlos was talking about earlier, where you have an athlete who might not necessarily be a superstar on their team, but their TikTok videos are really popular and they've got 5 million followers on TikTok. And oh, by the way, they also happen to be on the UCLA volleyball team or whatever it might be. So there's going to be student athletes that fall into that group that can make a lot of money. And then there's going to be the star quarterbacks. The Ohio State player, the quarterback, Ewers, I think that's how you pronounce it. His trading card deal is for $1 million. And I think the star athletes are gonna make a lot of money one way or another. But I also think that eventually it's going to, in some ways, start to mirror professional sports, where, if you look at a typical NFL team, there's only a handful of players, if that are really making any significant money from marketing. As Carlos can tell you, I mean, when you're working at an agency, yes, you want that offensive lineman who's going to make a lot of money for his playing contract with his team because he's protecting the quarterback's blind side. But you really want the star players because of the marketing dollars that follow.
Yeah, I think it's going to be massive. I think you kind of see what's happening. But if you look at collegiate sports, just pre-NIL, as it relates to professional sports, whether it's destination television, how they market the playoffs and the bowl series, that it already had that feel of professional sports. The only difference was the athletes weren't allowed to participate in some of the cash flow that was being distributed. So I think you have to anticipate that now these brands that are already activating around pro sports are going to start to look at other opportunities to do the same around collegiate sports. There will be federal legislation at some point. I mean, that's going to happen. Congress has been working through different variations. I think that everything that's happened this summer is going to make that easier. And once it's smoother for brands to get engaged, they'll figure it out. I mean, some, top Fortune 500 brands are already engaging in different ways. Like Allstate, they sponsor collegiate football, so they're looking at ways to activate around social impact and athletes that are giving back to their community. So they've kind of found that pathway in. So there's examples like that already. But I think once that it gets smoothed out for brands to be able to get involved, you're just going to see, I think, a much larger scale of Fortune 500 companies looking to activate around sports. Partially because most of the NCAA sponsorship deals are done through the media contract. So once again, if you think March Madness, like the companies, the capital ones, the AT&Ts, they've all done those deals through CBS and TNT, right? And basically CBS, TNT bought out those rights and they've sold the sponsorship. So those are all media deals. So these brands are going to be looking for activation ideas around their advertising units that they got as a result of those sponsorships. So, you can just see the writing on the wall in terms of it being inevitable that this is going to happen. It's just a matter of them just figuring out how they're going to do it. But I do think it'll be massive. I think Joe is right. It'll be top heavy. I think there's not really a middle class anymore. It's either got people making a lot of money or people not making that much. But the social media part of it also will create think of them more like influencers and athletes that are also able to monetize the fact that they're in college playing sports. Also the collegiate demographic, if you think the 18 to 25 demo, that's the most highly coveted demographic for most brands. So there's just a lot of reasons for companies to be spending money around collegiate athletes.
Thank you. It looks like we have another question on Zoom.
Great. Thanks, Christina. Austin, if you can unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and ask a question.
Hi, my name is Alston. Thank you both so much for being here. I kind of have a two-part question. First one is for Carlos. Can you just describe some of the day-to-day life as best you can as an agent or someone who works in a talent agency? And then for Joe or Carlos, can you also describe kind of the mechanisms for how name and image likeness deals get made? Like, do you interact with athletes? Do you interact with their representatives, that sort of nature?
I think I was first up. For us, I mean, if you think of like how we make our money, it's basically any revenue generating opportunity we can do on behalf of our clients that we can commission. So it's sponsorship deals, it's creating TV projects, it's selling book deals, it's creating YouTube channels, whatever we can do for our clients to help them make money where we can commission it. But to get to that point, there's a lot of layers in between. So we spend a lot of time thinking about recruiting because you always have to be thinking about that next generation, kind of who's next, who's really going to move the needle, who are the most, highly coveted athletes that we want on our platform that we feel like we can really plug into all of our different resources. When after you've recruited those athletes, which takes a bit of time, then you've got to service those accountants when they come on board, and they're not going to be superstars day one. So a lot of our work is, helping them build their social media. It's helping them from a PR perspective. It's, just kind of helping them learn the business, the strategy of some of the partnerships that they want to be in. Sometimes you take less money to be in business with a Gatorade, for example, or the right companies. Sometimes if it's something you're 50-50 on, it's okay to either say no or kind of just set your number, and if the company doesn't hit it, be happy to walk away. So that's all kind of the in-between time when you're educating and you're not necessarily making a ton of cash, but you do all that to get to the, the pot of gold, if you will, or that point where you hopefully have a superstar athlete that's performing at a high level on the field that's also, generating income off the field. So for us, the servicing, the recruiting, all that stuff is probably 70% of the job, and then the sales function obviously becomes very important, especially on the endorsement side of just, you can't wait for the phone to ring because it will ring, but for stuff you're not necessarily excited about. A lot of your time has to be spent thinking proactively about where should we be fishing? What companies should we be talking to? Keeping regular contact with your buyers, whether they're agencies that buy talent on behalf of their brands or the brands themselves direct, and just building those relationships and trying to be top of mind when they make that first phone call, when they think I need an athlete, you want them to be calling you. So, there's a lot of, all that type of work that really we don't necessarily get paid for, but you have to do that work to be able to get to the point where you can get paid.
I'll just add a couple random thoughts to that. One thing that Carlos has been talking about that is becoming more and more obvious in the college NIL space is that it's not just the agents representing the athletes who are looking for deals, it's corporate America looking to tap into the student athletes. And so you're starting to actually see a lot of agencies like WME and CAA, they have corporate consulting businesses where they represent the brands. Typically, they represent the brands in deciding what tournaments are we going to sponsor? What are we going to be a sponsor of the NFL or Major League Baseball or the US Open? But more and more of those brands are now saying, how can we get student athletes in our commercials? What should we do? And so there are agencies now that are really building whole departments based on helping corporate America get in touch with student athletes. And Carlos's agency is probably on both sides. They've got their athletes that they're offering to brands, and they represent brands that are looking for athletes. So it's kind of a win-win.
I'd offer just one small piece of clarification on that. Joe's absolutely right, but there is a church and state, because at the end of the day, our people on our consulting side, their clients are who they represent, so they have to keep them top of mind. I mean, just the most basic way to say it is if they don't, they will get fired. So they can't just look at our roster and say, here's all the guys you should take for your new activation. They have to do their research, they have to do their analysis and really decide, these are the people that make the most sense, and this is why for what you're trying to accomplish. I think where the synergies really lies, hopefully we have, somewhat of a critical mass of athletes and or celebrities, depending on the campaign, that fit all of those criteria that the brand is looking for. And I think the advantage is that, oftentimes we're going to be that first phone call. But your brand clients aren't going to be very happy if every time they see a list, it's all WME clients. So we're very mindful of that, and I just wanted to mention that because oftentimes people assume it's just very turnkey. This campaign comes for a brand that we represent, and we just plug all of our clients in. And unfortunately, it's just not that simple, but there are tons of synergies there.
So we've talked a lot about what this means for athletes, but how about what this means for schools? Their ability to draw in potential students, their relationship with the students that are being sponsored and their teams. Just going a little into that.
Well, the first thing that I think universities are dealing with is understanding the landscape. And there's at least one company that launched recently to be that sort of educator and advisor. It's called Altius Sports Partners, and they've signed up a handful of universities where they basically just explain to them what the rules are and provide advice as to how to operate within those rules. And I think that's step one is understanding how to play in the field. The NCAA, as I mentioned before, is sort of really opposed to schools using NIL as a recruiting tool, but it's going to happen. It's going to be used as a recruiting tool. There will be inducements, and I think it's the pay-for-play component probably is going to avoiding pay-for-play is probably more likely than avoiding payments or using it as an inducement to recruit players. I think, there are universities already who are touting boosters who will provide money to their student athletes, not just for free, but in exchange for making appearances and, sending out social media posts. But the boosters have committed like X amount of dollars to the athletic department in exchange for NIL activations.
Yeah, I think it's so funny. I try not to be too much of a cynic. I know people are cynical about agents too, so who am I to be cynical about the NCAA? But more and more we get, the kids we're talking to, and we're 2 months or 3 months into this, more and more the question now is coming up, well, what if I get a deal through my school, right? And obviously we know most of these kids are probably being told to ask that from their school, right? And the reality is, as Joe just said, schools aren't even allowed to really deliver deals to student athletes. I mean, they have varying policies. Some are, we can introduce the brand to you or your representation. Some policies are, we don't even want to be involved in the process of facilitating the introduction. So some of them try to they have these policies in writing. The practice, I'm sure, is very different. But you can already see bubbling up what Joe's talking about. And then you see the real kind of practical examples. I mean, about Amani Bates to Memphis, FedEx is headquartered there. FedEx is, at least announced, or it was a strong rumor that's in the blogs and out there that they did a pretty significant deal with Amani Bates for him to go to Memphis. And the NCAA ruled that there was no foul play there because FedEx made an independent decision to sign him. But I can guarantee you, I know how these deals work. There's no way you show up at a campus, decide to go there, and have a deal within 24 hours. That just doesn't happen. So we know that somewhere in advance of him committing to Memphis, that was on the table. Whether it came directly from FedEx or it came through the university, we'll never know. But there's some real examples. The University of Kentucky, there's contracts floating around where they're offering their players, $200,000 to run summer camps. So that's going to happen. I mean, you see Nick Saban, such a recruiting play, right? When he says, my starting quarterback has already got $1 million in deals, 2 days in NIL. Clearly was a recruiting play for him to induce other top level football players when it come to Alabama. So, it's clear where it's heading. It's certainly going to be part of their pitch book. And if it's not, they're going to lose to their competitor schools. So I think that's going to be part of the conversation. I think unlike, I'm curious to see how this plays out because I think in the NFL, for example, or the NBA, they don't want their star. If you're a Gatorade team, you don't want your star player endorsing BioSteel, right? So the marketing people at these teams are much more open to having the agents and our players call and say, this is kind of what we're thinking. Could you help facilitate an introduction to the Gatorade folks? Because that's going to be our first phone call. Most marketing people on a professional sports team will really appreciate that phone call, especially if you're calling about a star player. I don't know if it's going to be the same for colleges. I think, initially they're going to try to see if they can facilitate that introduction directly with the player and kind of keep the agent out of the conversation. Who knows? I think if we get to a point where, the agents are bringing competitive products because the school's not being a good partner, that will likely change. But, it varies according to school. UCLA, I keep naming them just because one of our first guys goes to school there, and they've been phenomenal. They have really engaged with us and worked very closely with us. I don't anticipate that being the norm for all schools.
So it looks like we're wrapping up, but we have time for maybe one more question. Do you have any advice for student athletes that would like to be sponsored? How they should kind of put their brand out there?
Well, Carlos will have a much better answer, I think. But building your brand is huge, and there's a couple platforms that are sort of leading the way in this space to help student athletes build their brand, understand the size and scale of their brand currently. So if you look at companies like Open Doors and Influencer, you'll get a sense of what the importance placed on social media, I think. And we've talked about how you can maybe not be the star athlete, but your social media presence can help you make some money.
Yeah, I consistent with that. I think, our social media department is teaching us a lot about just being smart and how you navigate the space. I think what we saw, especially for the super high performance athletes, and this goes back since social media really became popular, is a lot of them early in their careers, they just don't engage. They show their sports highlights, they show pictures with their family, and that's it, right? And they have pretty low engagement. Their growth is kind of just really a subject to them being famous at what they do, but not really because people are so intrigued by their life. And I think now with the advent of NIL, and most of these athletes, by the way, when they become professionals and they see that they can really make money off of their social media, that's when the light bulb goes on. So that's when they realize, oh, maybe I didn't get this contract because someone else had a better social media following, or maybe I didn't get as much as I want on my Nike deal because, they didn't see my social media as being compelling. So that's the spark that makes a lot of these athletes go, okay, I want to figure it out now. So now we're seeing it at the collegiate level. These guys are saying, you mean if I have 500,000, Instagram followers, that means I could make a couple $100,000 a year potentially while I'm in college. So it's making them more motivated to do more. So I think, and this is speaking, I was asked to answer this for young athletes. I think showing your life, like kind of showing what you're doing outside of playing your sport, showing what your interests are, engaging with platforms liking and engaging on other pages that really kind of show what you're interested in, because that can bring fans. Because someone may say, who is this person that keeps liking my comments or keeps commenting on my page? And they go to your page and see that you're a high performance athlete in that college, maybe it's a college they went to, and that can bring you in a whole new community with a whole new group of fans that can really help build your following. And there's a lot of tricks along those lines that, I think can help. And they're not really tricks, it's just kind of the process of building your social media. But I think that's paramount. I just think being in the social media space, I think also PR is the first time that people really get to meet you. People that don't know who you are. So if you're in, pick your newspaper in a town where you play sports, if they don't follow tennis, if they don't follow volleyball, if they don't follow basketball, but they read this great story about you doing great stuff in the community or being a great student or whatever it is that you're good at besides playing your sport, that draws people to you. That creates new fans for you. That creates new social media followers. So I think PR for me is kind of the first bedrock of marketing, and couple that with really being smart about your social media. I think those are just two areas that student athletes have to be laser focused on.
That's some great advice. I'd like to say thank you to the audience for listening in and everyone on Zoom. And then a big thank you to both Joe and Carlos for joining today. It's been a pleasure and very insightful discussion.
Great. Well, let's give it up for Joe and Carlos.